In the previous video, we made it so we could throw balls at our bottles and knock them off the wall. In this video, we'll improve the appearance of what happens when this occurs. What we want to have happen is when the bottle hits the floor, the bottle should disappear and be replaced with a collection of shards, little glass fragments. I've prepared a shard object, which is basically a very small, simple little 3D model that if I open up here and take a look at, it's just a simple, irregular, flat thing that could conceivably look like a piece of glass. The material isn't correct, but that's okay because we'll end up using the same material that we used for the bottle. So let's import that into Unity by drag and dropping the shard object into Assets. Here it is, here's our shard. So it's got a prefab in here and also the raw mesh object as well. By default, when you import an object, Unity can sometimes create a materials folder which contains the materials that it thinks are appropriate for the object. For example, if you were to design a more complicated model inside a modeling tool and you defined your own materials in that tool, Unity would try and import those. But we don't really need that for this model here. So we'll select the shard object, we'll go to Model, and we'll go to the Materials section, turn off Import Materials, and click Apply to save these changes. We can now delete this materials folder, which we don't need anymore, and Unity will also not try to recreate it for us. So we'll right-click, delete. Depending on your modeling tool, you may also want to turn off the rig and animation settings. Depending on your modeling tool, you may have got an animation rig or skeleton in place, or you may have animations. We can just turn those off. That'll simplify it. Wasn't really necessary for this model, but it might be for future ones. When the bottle shatters, we're going to use a particle system to create the individual shards, as opposed to creating multiple instantiations of a shard prefab. This is useful for two reasons. One is that particle systems are more efficient. Additionally, because we're using a particle system, we can more effectively tune how it looks, rather than having to play the game over and over again. Let's begin by creating a particle system. We'll go Game Object, Particle System. By default, it uses the Unity default particle system, which is not really appropriate for what we're trying to do here. By default, a Unity particle system draws sprites, but we want to draw meshes. We can do this by scrolling down to the very bottom of the settings, opening the Render section, and changing the render mode from billboard to mesh. You can see that it's now drawing cubes. We need to use the shard mesh. The shard file contains two different assets, one called default, which is a prefab, and one called default also, which is a mesh. You might notice that the mesh one, it's really faintly visible. There's like a few lines showing the wireframe outline. And if I make it bigger, it's slightly easier to see. Now, we don't want to copy in the shard file itself because that doesn't actually contain a mesh. This is actually a prefab. What we want to have instead is the mesh itself. So we'll drag the default mesh into the mesh slot here. Additionally, we want to use the glass material that we set up earlier. We'll use the glass material by dragging it into the material slot. Let's zoom in and see how it looks. The particle system is emitting all these shards, all flying out. They're all meshes, they're all 3D objects. They don't quite look like a glass explosion. Let's tune that a bit. First of all, we want our objects to fade out over time, because right now they kind of vanish after the end of their flight. So we'll go up to the Color Over Lifetime section and turn it on. We'll go to the Color Settings, and we'll change the alpha by clicking on the top right notch here and changing it to 0. This means that as they fly, they become dimmer and dimmer. Not really easy to see at the moment, but it will become apparent later on. Additionally, we want our objects to respond to gravity. Right now they're flying straight up in the sky. That's not really what glass does. So we'll go to the gravity modifier section and change it from 0 to 1. Notice how they're starting moving upwards and then falling down. That's more realistic. The next thing to change is their rotation. They all start at the same orientation. Let's change that. We'll go to Start Rotation, and we'll change it from 0, click on the little drop-down arrow, and change it to Random Between Two Constants. Then change it from -180 to 180. Now, all the glass shards are appearing at a random initial rotation. We also want them to spin as they fly through the air. We'll go to the Rotation Over Lifetime section, turn it on, set the angular velocity to be random between two constants again, and set these values from -180 to 180. That means that they'll be spinning at a different rate as they fly as well. Already this is looking much better. Let's move our particle system a little closer to the action. I'll go to the top view and position it over the wall, and go to my side view and move it down there. This will make it easy to see how it fits into the scale of things. I'll zoom in, turn off ortho view, and now I'm flying around here looking at this. Okay. As glass shards land, we want them to bounce. We can do this pretty easily by turning on collision. Scroll into the collision section and change the mode from planes to world. Now they're all going to bounce. Unfortunately, they're colliding with each other. To fix this, what we'll do is we'll turn off Enable Dynamic Colliders. We'll also turn off Interior Collisions. When the glass lands, it bounces and then it keeps moving. We want it to not do that. So we'll increase the dampen factor to 0.5. We'll also change bounce to 0.8, so they don't bounce quite as much. This looks more realistic and is closer to what glass actually does when it lands. Finally, let's make our glass shards shrink as they fade. We'll go to Size over Lifetime and turn it on, and we'll change the curve from its default flat value to one that goes from 0 to 1. We can easily do that by clicking on this downward sloping icon at the bottom. So now, as they land, they fade out and they also shrink. One last thing to set up. Currently, our glass system is more like a glass fountain than it is a glass explosion. That's because it's continuously emitting particles at a constant rate. What we want to have happen is to have an initial burst of particles and then nothing else. We can very easily control this by going up to the very top of the settings, turning off looping, and then going to the emission section and changing the rate, setting that to 0, and then adding in a burst by clicking on the plus button. We'll have a burst of between 15 to 20 shards. Additionally, the shards should emit from a very small area. So we open up the shape section, we'll change it from a radius of 1 to a radius of 0.5, much smaller. Let's see how this looks. We'll click on Simulate, and we'll get a burst of particles. Importantly, we'll only get one. If we want to see it again, we can click Stop, and then Simulate. Stop, Simulate. Great. We're now done building our particle system. Let's save this as a prefab. We'll rename the object to be Glass Explosion. And we'll drag it into the Assets folder and make it a prefab. Now we want our bottles to explode into shards when they hit the floor. Let's go to our bottle object. We'll add a script that detects when it hits the floor. Click Add Component and type Bottle. We'll create it and add it, and we'll open it in MongoDB. There we are. The bottle class is very simple. When we detect that the bottle has collided with an object that is tagged floor, we'll remove the object and instantiate a prefab, which will be the glass explosion. We'll create our prefab reference by saying public game object destroy prefab. We'll get rid of the start and update functions, we don't need them, and we'll replace it with a function called on collision enter, which receives a collision object called C. Well, we can call it whatever we like. I'm going to call it C. And we'll check to see if the game object that we collided with has the tag floor. And if it does, then the bottle hit the floor, so remove the bottle and replace it with a glass explosion. So if c.gameObject.compare tag floor, this is a tag we'll have to add in a moment, then we'll instantiate the glass explosion by saying var glass explosion equals instantiate destroy prefab. We'll also cast that to a game object. We want the position of this glass explosion to be the position of the bottle by saying glass explosion transform position equals this transform position. Additionally, we want to rotate the glass explosion so that the forward direction, which is the direction in which particles will be thrown, is upwards, because the forward direction is the direction in which particles are thrown. So we'll say glass explosion dot transform dot forward equals vector3.up, so the global upwards direction. We'll also destroy this glass explosion in 5 seconds, so after all the particles should be gone. So destroy glass explosion in 5 seconds. And we'll also destroy the bottle right now. Destroy game object right now. Okay. 2 more things left to do before we're ready. We'll go back into Unity. We will attach our glass explosion prefab to the destroy prefab slot. And finally, we'll make the floor have the tag floor by clicking on it, going to the tag menu, and choosing Add Tag. This takes us to the Tags and Layers inspector. In the Tags list, click on the plus button. We'll be adding a new tag. We'll call it Floor. Press Enter to save it. Now go back to the floor and change its tag from untagged to floor. Let's test it out. I forgot to remove the old glass explosion. We'll do that in a moment. Let's aim a ball, throw it at the bottle, try and knock the bottle off. There we go. And there was some glass. Probably we should reduce the height of the wall as well to make the glass bottle explosion look nicer. So we'll delete the glass explosion, and also we'll reduce the height of the wall, bring that down, and I'll move the bottle down as well. A bit further down to make it actually touch on the wall. There we go. Start it one more time. Okay. I've already made it too small, actually. And there we are. Gameplay in our VR game.